There are factories that disappear with a bang, and there are factories that disappear in a quieter, more unsettling way. Not through a single dramatic demolition, not because the sign is ripped down overnight, but because the thing that made the building matter is slowly taken out of it. First, the difficult jobs go. Then the specialist work. Then the people who know how to listen to a cabinet, how to feel a fault in a board, how to tell from the way a speaker moves that something is wrong before any meter confirms it. At some point, the brand may still exist, the catalogue may still exist, the logo may still exist, but the factory, in the real sense, is already gone. That is what makes the story of Carlsbro so revealing. For years, Carlsbro was not the glamorous face of British amplification. It was something more grounded and in some ways more important. It was the sound equipment of working bands, club acts, dance halls, rehearsal rooms, social clubs, pub stages, school halls, church events, small-town discos, semi-professional musicians, and people trying to make a living one night at a time. It did not build its reputation by becoming the most mythologized brand in rock history. It built it by being there, by being practical, by being loud enough, reliable enough, affordable enough, and close enough to the lives of ordinary performers that the name became familiar on backlines all over Britain. This was a company that grew out of Nottinghamshire, out of repair work, local demand, and a very British kind of industrial improvisation. It began small enough to feel improvised, personal, almost intimate. Then it became serious. By the late 1960s, there were enough musicians and venues using Carlsbro equipment that a separate retail arm was set up. In the 1970s, the business moved into a purpose-built factory at Cross Drive, in Kirkby, in Ashfield. By 1980, the company said its products were sold in more than 24 countries and in hundreds of stores across the UK. It expanded into PA, into solid-state designs, into retail, and later into the acquisition of HH Electronics. This was not a hobbyist side story. It was a real industrial enterprise with a footprint, a workforce, and a national presence. And yet the company never occupied the same place in public memory as Marshall. That difference matters, because the story of Carlsbro is not only about rise and decline. It is also about the difference between prestige and infrastructure. Marshall became legend. Carlsbro became useful. Marshall became iconic. Carlsbro became dependable. One was the dream amp. The other was the amp that often got the job done. That should have made it durable. In one sense, it did. The Carlsbro name survived founder illness, ownership changes, market shifts, and even administration. But survival of the name is not the same thing as survival of the factory. That is the central tension in this story. If a brand continues but the design, assembly, cabinet work, testing, and skilled manufacturing are moved elsewhere, what exactly survives? Is the company still what it was, or has only the label remained? To understand why that question matters, you have to go back to the beginning, back before the catalogues and dealer networks, back before the industrial estate and the shops, back before the company could sell the idea of British sound as heritage. Before all of that, there was a young man in Nottinghamshire doing electronics work, making and repairing things in cramped spaces, discovering that the needs of musicians were not being met properly, and realizing that if he could solve that problem, he might build more than a product. He might build a world, and for a while he did. The deeper mystery is not how Carlsbro rose. In the Britain of the early 1960s, with local venues full, bands multiplying, and electrical ingenuity meeting cultural demand, a company like Carlsbro almost makes perfect sense. The harder question is what happened after it rose. How does a company rooted in regional manufacturing, direct knowledge, and practical value lose the very work that gave it strength? How does an amplifier maker that once embodied local craft and industrial confidence become one more example of a name surviving after the place behind it falls silent? That is the real story of the Carlsbro plant. Not simply how it was built, but how a factory that helped power working musicians became part of a much larger pattern, the long separation of British industrial names from British industrial production. Carlsbro did not begin in a corporate office, or in a university lab, or with a grand theory about disrupting an industry. It began in the untidy, improvised way many durable manufacturing stories begin, with a specific problem, a person who knew how to solve it, and the absence of anyone else doing the job properly. Stuart Mercer was not born into a polished musical equipment empire. In the early account of the company's origins, he appears first as a young working man around Nottinghamshire, a TV repairman, and someone skilled with wood pattern work, not as a celebrity entrepreneur. He had electronics knowledge, practical hands, and a background close enough to making and fixing things that he understood equipment as something physical, not abstract. That distinction would matter later. Carlsbro never came out of theory, it came out of use. The decisive moment was almost modest. A musician recognized that Mercer knew electronics and started complaining about the lack of good amplifiers. Mercer was persuaded to build one. He spent time working out a circuit and design, built a small combo amp, and found himself, at first, with a product and no immediate customer. The player who had prompted the project lost interest. That could easily have been the end of it. Instead, Mercer took the amp to his grandfather's shop in Sheffield. His grandfather liked it, thought he could sell it, and asked for another. That is how many industrial stories really begin, not with certainty, but with one person saying, "Make me another." Mercer was still working his day job. The amplifier work began in spare hours, around ordinary life, and in spaces that were plainly not designed for manufacturing. He later described building the electronics in the bathroom and then moving things aside so he could work on cabinets. When space became impossible, he found a tiny workshop in the back of a greengrocer's premises in Mansfield Woodhouse. It is one of those details that tells you almost everything about the company's character before the company itself fully existed. This was not a venture-backed fantasy of scale. It was a workshop reality. Limited room, limited capital, and a willingness to keep building anyway. That physical scrappiness was paired with something just as important. The work was close to musicians. Mercer was not designing for an abstract market segment. He was repairing equipment, hearing complaints, being asked for special solutions, and learning from the way bands actually used their gear. Early on, musicians such as Shane Fenton and the Fentones asked him to build things to specific needs. One bass player wanted better sound from his cabinet. Mercer experimented with reflex cabinet designs to get better bass response without making the cabinet absurdly large. In other words, Carlsbro's earliest advantage was not branding. It was that its founder was paying attention to real performance problems. That closeness to use matters because it shaped the company's whole later identity. There are brands that become great by building fantasies. There are others that become great by solving recurring frustrations. Carlsbro belonged to the second tradition. It did not rise because it sold a myth of rebellion. It rose because British musicians, especially those outside the highest professional tier, needed equipment that worked. The business side was precarious. Mercer later recalled going out on his own with only a very small amount of capital, earned from installing an intercom system in an ice cream factory. His wife Sheila was crucial in those years, carefully tracking earnings and expenses, while the business produced only a tiny weekly profit. That detail is easy to miss, but it is central. Many industrial origin stories prefer the lone inventor myth. The real story is usually more domestic, more fragile, and more collective than that. In Carlsbro's case, the company was stabilized in part because someone at home was making sure the books made sense while the founder worked late into the night. Those nights were long. Mercer described working until early morning, trying to make and repair enough equipment to keep the household going. That image belongs in the story because it connects the later factory to the earliest labor behind it. Before there was a plant floor, there was exhaustion. Before there was a product line, there was repair work. Before there was a reputation, there was a newly married couple trying to make a tiny manufacturing venture viable week by week. And yet from that fragile beginning, a pattern began to form. Mercer was building amps, repairing amps, and learning what players needed. The products were not yet symbols, they were tools. That gave Carlsbro a certain honesty very early on. The company's future would always be tied to practicality. It was born less from spectacle than from service. This also helps explain why Carlsbro developed the kind of culture it did. A brand born in direct contact with working musicians tends to value reliability, maintainability, and affordability. It learns quickly that a customer who depends on a piece of equipment for paid work thinks differently from a customer shopping for identity. A gigging musician does not want mythology first. He wants to know whether the amp will hold up, whether it will be repaired, whether it sounds right in a room that is too small, too full, too noisy, or too difficult. Carlsbro came out of that world. In later years, the company would celebrate its age, its Britishness, its long history, and the players associated with the brand. But those later heritage claims all rest on this earlier truth. Carlsbro started as a practical answer to a local shortage. A young repairman in cramped rooms and borrowed workshop space began making amplifiers because the market around him was not serving musicians well enough. That beginning gave the company something many later brands struggle to manufacture artificially: legitimacy rooted in necessity. It also meant that when the wider music boom arrived, Carlsbro was positioned to catch it. The early 1960s created extraordinary conditions for any company capable of supplying sound equipment. Britain's music scene was changing fast. Dance halls, pubs, clubs, social venues, and local halls were full of groups trying to be louder, tighter, and more professional. Electric guitars demanded amplification. Vocals needed reinforcement. Bass players wanted deeper response. Bands wanted equipment that could survive transport, setup, sweat, impact, and the chaos of live use. This was not an abstract cultural shift. It produced an enormous material demand for things: cabinets, heads, combos, speakers, plugs, handles, covers, mixers, stands, repairs, replacements. The larger legends of British music history tend to focus on stars, records, and London, but the industrial side of the story was often regional. The culture needed makers, tinkerers, repair shops, cabinet builders, electronics technicians, timber cutters, and people willing to work on the less glamorous problem of getting sound from a stage to a room without everything failing halfway through the set. Companies such as Vox and Selmer had entered this world earlier. Marshall would become the most famous amplifier name of all. But there was also space for strong regional manufacturers whose reputations grew through circuits of use rather than pure celebrity. That is where Carlsbro fit. As the group scene grew in the Nottingham area, Mercer's business grew with it. He eventually left TV repair work to focus on sound equipment full-time. By the middle of the decade, the business had grown enough to employ staff. The gear was circulating beyond a single town. Carlsbro PA systems could be seen around Nottinghamshire. The company was still not London-centred, and that is important. It was building from the provinces outward, from actual use into reputation. Mercer later admitted that during the beat boom, he sometimes regretted not being bigger, soon enough to exploit the moment more aggressively. That reflection is revealing. It shows both the opportunity and the company's scale limits. Britain's pop explosion created a huge demand spike, but scaling a manufacturing business fast enough to meet it required capital, labour, space, and planning that young firms rarely possess. In that sense, Carlsbro's path was both fortunate and constrained. It grew during the right years, but not so fast that it lost control completely. By the late 1960s, the company's own later history said that enough bands and venues were using Carlsbro equipment and enough people were coming to the factory that a separate retail arm was set up. That was a significant step. It suggests that Carlsbro was no longer just making equipment. It was beginning to build an ecosystem around the brand: manufacturing, showroom function, and retail presence. Keith Woodcock was recruited into sales, and from that point, the company's story widened beyond workshop production. This is where the Carlsbro story becomes especially interesting. Many British manufacturing firms either remained small-scale specialists or chased scale without building a broader commercial network. Carlsbro attempted something more ambitious. It grew a retail side alongside manufacturing. By 1970, the first Carlsbro Sound Centre shop had opened in Mansfield to sell the equipment being produced. Over time, that expanded into larger retail operations in places such as Sheffield, Nottingham, Leicester, and a major Mansfield site. The company was not only making sound equipment, it was helping shape how musical equipment was sold in the Midlands and beyond. That dual identity mattered. A manufacturer who also understands retail sees the market differently. It hears what buyers ask for. It sees which products move, which ones come back with faults, which price points hold, which musicians are moving up from beginner gear, and which categories are emerging. It also means the firm is exposed to more kinds of risk: retail margins, stock movement, cash flow, and changing consumer habits all begin to influence the wider company. But in the late 1960s and early 1970s, this broader structure looked like strength. Carlsbro's own later account claimed that by 1968, its amplifiers were being used by major acts, including Herman's Hermits, the Hollies, the Beatles, and the Rolling Stones. Whether every artist association is equally well documented, the broader point is plausible and important. The company had moved beyond purely local recognition. It was no longer a backroom Midlands maker. It was now part of Britain's visible amplification culture. Even more evocative is another company claim that Carlsbro sold its 50 top valve heads to Jim Marshall's guitar shop before Marshall made amps of his own. Whether remembered as business trivia or as an almost symbolic moment, it captures the fluidity of that era. The amplifier world had not yet settled into a neat hierarchy of legends. The future giants had not all become giants yet. There was space for regional makers to matter. And Carlsbro mattered because it addressed a specific slice of the market with seriousness. It was British-made, built close to the customer base, and rooted in solving practical performance needs. It was also flexible enough to grow from direct sales into more formal retail operations. That combination made the company more substantial than nostalgia sometimes allows. Still, even in its rise, you can sense the structure of its later vulnerability. A company tied to working musicians does not always enjoy the thick margins of luxury branding. A company growing through practical demand can become dependent on constant movement, constant gigs, constant local scenes, constant replenishment, constant affordability. That is a powerful engine in expansion years, but it can become a trap if market conditions harden or if bigger international pressures change the economics of making equipment domestically. At this stage, however, none of that was obvious. Carlsbro looked like a regional industrial success story. It had the founder, it had the products, it had the market, it had the retail expansion. It had the cultural wind at its back. Then it suffered the kind of blow that destroys many companies before they ever reach maturity. Industrial history is full of moments when a company's survival depends less on brilliance than on what it does in the first week after disaster. For Carlsbro, one of those moments came when the cabinet factory burned down. Mercer later described arriving to find the building devastated, the roof gone, the stock and machinery destroyed. The cause was never fully settled to his satisfaction. The fire brigade reportedly attributed it to an electrical fault, though the power had supposedly been turned off. Whatever the exact mechanism, the effect was clear enough. This was not a minor setback. It was the kind of event that ends undercapitalized firms. Inventory gone, tools gone, production interrupted, insurance inadequate, momentum broken. The telling detail is not only that the factory burned, but that the company was not insured enough. That sentence belongs to the anatomy of British small and mid-sized manufacturing. Growth often runs ahead of formal protection. Firms expand in spirit faster than in finance. They are successful enough to own more than before, but not secure enough to absorb catastrophe cleanly. That was the position Carlsbro found itself in. And yet the business did not die. Mercer's response was immediate. They bought new tools and restarted production within days. That kind of recovery is not romantic. It is exhausting, improvised, and brutal. But it tells you something fundamental about the company. Carlsbro's culture was built around making things happen under pressure. It had emerged from cramped spaces, improvised workshops, and thin capital. It had learned resilience before it learned scale. In that sense, the fire was devastating, but it was also a test of the habits the company had built from the beginning. There is another important detail in this period. Carlsbro had already been planning a move to a new, purpose-built factory on an industrial estate. The fire did not create ambition from nowhere. It collided with ambition that was already there. That matters because it changes the meaning of the disaster. It was not simply destruction followed by random survival. It was destruction that accelerated a transition the company had already been preparing for. The result was the move to Cross Drive in Kirkby and Ashfield. By one company history, the rapidly expanding business moved in 1971 to a purpose-built 10,000 square foot factory there. By the mid-1970s, after an extension, the site had grown to around 21,000 square feet. In the 1975 profile, Mercer was described as the head of a 21,000 square foot factory employing around 70 people. The plant was no longer an improvised workshop. It was a real manufacturing facility on a Nottinghamshire industrial estate. That transformation changes the emotional scale of the story. A young man making electronics in a bathroom is one kind of narrative. A 21,000 square foot factory with a workforce, a timber mill, assembly areas, test benches, and expanding production is another. The fire sits between those two stages. It is the hinge between vulnerable smallness and confident industrial scale. This was also the moment when Carlsbro's technical evolution became more significant. Mercer said, a major part of the company's success in the mid-1970s came from its solid-state range, which he had introduced about 18 months earlier after watching transistor technology mature. That detail matters for two reasons. First, it shows that Carlsbro was not simply a nostalgic valve company stuck in the past. It was willing to move with technology when it thought the new solutions were reliable enough. Second, it shows that the founder remained deeply involved in design. He was not just a salesman or figurehead. He was still building the company's technical identity. That combination of resilience and adaptation is exactly what made Carlsbro formidable in its best years. It could recover from disaster, and it could read the market. It could keep the practical musician in view while still following technological change. It could expand production without entirely losing the founder's direct imprint. The recovery after the fire also says something about the culture of the workforce. A company does not restart manufacturing in days if it consists only of a logo and a promise. It needs people who know what to do. It needs routines, relationships with suppliers, habits of assembly, testing discipline, and the emotional stamina to continue when the rational move might be to fold. In later years, when people remember old British factories, there is often a tendency to focus on heroic founders. But a plant is also a collective memory system. The people on the floor carry part of the company in their hands. That is why factory loss matters so much. When a plant disappears, the loss is not merely square footage. It is the disruption of accumulated practical intelligence. Carlsbro's post-fire recovery reminds us how much of the company's strength lived not in the badge, but in the manufacturing culture behind it. And once Cross Drive was established, that culture had a physical home. The company now had something every ambitious regional maker wanted, a site large enough to suggest permanence. Factories do not become symbols by accident. They become symbols because a place begins to concentrate more than work. It concentrates confidence, routine, identity, and the feeling that a local enterprise has become real enough to alter the meaning of a town. For Carlsbro, Cross Drive in Kirkby and Ashfield was that place. It sat on an industrial estate in Nottinghamshire, the sort of environment that rarely receives lyrical treatment in official histories but often matters more than grand headquarters ever do. These estates are where practical Britain made itself, behind ordinary roads, in units built for utility, near transport routes rather than beauty. The point of such a site was not romance, it was movement. Materials in, products out, vehicles loading, staff arriving, repairs returning, goods circulating to dealers and shops. One company history emphasised that the 1970s move brought Carlsbro near the country's first motorway and introduced more modern design and production methods. Even if that sounds like standard corporate language, there is a truth inside it. Geography matters. The location of a factory shapes its range, its logistics, its workforce, and its sense of what kind of company it can become. Cross Drive represented the point at which Carlsbro could think, not just like a workshop that supplied local demand, but like a manufacturer with national reach. Inside a plant like that, the industrial story becomes tangible. Timber would be cut and prepared for cabinets, coverings and hardware fitted, chassis assembled, components wired, units tested, faults traced, labels applied, finished amplifiers and speaker cabinets, stacked, boxed, and sent out to the wider world. The rhythm of such a factory is part electrical, part carpentry, part logistics, part hearing. Amplifier manufacturing is not only about circuits, it is also about enclosure, durability, vibration, and the physical truth that a live sound product has to survive being moved by tired people in bad conditions. That physical truth is exactly why Carlsbro appealed to working players. The company came from a world where equipment had to endure. It had to function in clubs, in pub rooms, in working men's venues, in civic halls, in school gyms, in rehearsal lockups. It had to be repaired when something failed. It had to be priced for people who earned money from it slowly, gig by gig. Cross Drive gave that whole ethos a centre. By the early 1980s, Carlsbro's address at Cross Drive was appearing regularly in advertising and trade listings. The plant was not a hidden origin myth anymore. It was part of the company's visible identity. By 1980, the business said its products were being sold in over 26 countries and through 300 stores in the UK. This is one of those figures that helps clarify what Carlsbro had become. It was no longer merely a Midlands success story. It was a British manufacturing concern with export presence and a dense domestic dealer network. The retail side mattered too. The Carlsbro Sound Centre shops helped turn the brand into more than a factory badge. They made it a retail destination. In 1983, the company described how a Mansfield shop opened in 1970 to sell the amplification equipment produced by the Associated Manufacturing Company, and how that expanded into major retail locations in Mansfield, Sheffield, Nottingham, and Leicester. In one striking boast, after a Leicester deal, the firm described itself as the largest musical retailer on one site in Europe. Whether or not that claim was strictly precise in every metric, it conveys the scale of Carlsbro's ambition. This was not a company content to build quietly in the background. It wanted to occupy multiple positions in the music equipment chain: design, manufacture, and sale. And yet the deeper atmosphere of the brand remained tied to utility. Unlike firms whose whole identity rested on elite endorsement, Carlsbro felt closer to the broad middle of live music culture. That is not a weakness in itself. In fact, it may have been the source of its strength. A company serving the semi-professional and working musician can build a huge installed base. It can become familiar, not through myth, but through repetition. It becomes the thing people have actually seen, carried, plugged in, borrowed, repaired, and played through. The Cross Drive factory would have embodied that relationship between product and place. The amp head on the stage was not an abstract British artifact. It was tied to a road, a unit, a workforce, a town in Nottinghamshire, and a chain of local skills. A cabinet built there carried not just a logo, but a regional manufacturing history. This is one reason the later outsourcing story hits so differently in the case of Carlsbro. When a brand has built itself largely on aura, moving production can seem almost natural. When a brand has built itself on practical, place-based manufacture, the loss of the plant feels more substantial. Cross-Drive was not only where Carlsbro made products, it was where Carlsbro became believable as an industrial power, and for a time, the future looked open. The company had survived disaster, scaled up, modernized, expanded retail, and built a serious plant. It had moved from valves into solid state without abandoning the market. It understood. It had created products for guitar, bass, and PA. It had enough momentum to think nationally and internationally. The plant itself stood as proof that a regional British manufacturer could grow from small-scale improvisation into a recognized industrial brand. But growth in manufacturing is never the same as in vulnerability. A company can get bigger without becoming safer. It can widen its footprint while quietly deepening its dependence on a narrow band of customers and a difficult economic structure. The very qualities that made Carlsbro valuable to working musicians would later expose it to pressures that prestige brands could sometimes escape. Cross-Drive made the company visible. The next phase would show what kind of business visibility was supporting. There is a particular kind of industrial success that does not receive enough attention because it is not glamorous enough for legend. It is the success of becoming ordinary in the best possible way. Not forgettable, but dependable. Not a curiosity, but a fixture. A product line becomes common enough to enter working life. People stop talking about it as a novelty and start assuming it will be there. That was Carlsbro in its strongest decades. If Marshall came to symbolize rock star aspiration, Carlsbro came to symbolize a different musical economy, the world of the semi-professional, the club circuit, the local venue, the touring act below the highest tier, the mobile entertainer, the church hall PA, the school performance, the village function, the cover band, the social club singer, the regional sound provider. In a later gear history assessment, Carlsbro's amps were described as the mainstay of the semi-pro scene for more than 2 decades. That may be the single most important sentence anyone ever wrote about the company, because it explains both why Carlsbro mattered and why it remains slightly under-remembered. The semi-professional scene is enormous, but it does not always generate mythology. It generates use. It consumes equipment in large numbers, but not always with the status effects that create lasting cultural glamour. It is the world that keeps many manufacturers alive, while other brands harvest more prestige from a narrower layer of top-end visibility. Carlsbro understood that world. The company's move into solid-state ranges in the 1970s was a major part of that understanding. Solid-state amplification, when done properly, could offer reliability, durability, and cost structures well suited to musicians who needed performance without boutique pricing. Models such as the Stingray and related ranges helped Carlsbro compete effectively in the real market of working players. The company also developed portable PA and mixer amplifier products, recognizing that many users did not only need a guitar amp, they needed complete sound solutions for live situations. This matters because Carlsbro was never just a guitar amp story. It was part of a broader live sound culture. Portable PA, powered units, cabinets, speaker systems, amplification for different applications. These were all part of the company's evolution. That wider approach brought Carlsbro closer to the everyday infrastructure of performance. It was not only supplying iconic tone, it was supplying audibility. By 1980, according to Carlsbro's own history, the company's products were sold in over 26 countries and in 300 UK stores. In 1984, it expanded further by acquiring HH Electronics, itself a significant name in portable PA and solid-state amplification. This was a serious move. It suggests that Carlsbro was not merely defending market share but actively trying to consolidate position in live sound and amplification. From a business perspective, this was rational. The market was broadening. Musical equipment retail was becoming more sophisticated. Users wanted wider ranges. Sound reinforcement was not a niche curiosity anymore. More venues, more events, and more types of performers meant more demand for practical audio systems. Carlsbro, with its roots in both manufacturing and retail, was well placed to respond. From a social perspective, these were the years when the brand would have become woven into thousands of small musical careers. A company like Carlsbro does not matter only because of famous artists. It matters because of ordinary cultural labour, the singer who could afford a serviceable PA, the band that could rehearse because someone owned a reliable combo, the school that could stage a show, the mobile DJ who needed something loud, transportable, and repairable, the local shop assistant who sold the gear and explained the controls, the repair tech who kept older units alive, the driver who moved boxed cabinets out of cross-drive, the cabinet worker who cut, fitted, and finished enclosures, the spouses who accepted evenings and weekends shaped by gigs and equipment problems. This is what disappears when we talk only about brand names and not about the ecosystems beneath them. Carlsbro's importance lay precisely there. It served the middle ground of music culture, where most actual musical life takes place. But the workhorse identity had a hidden cost. To be the dependable choice for working musicians is to operate in a market that is often intensely price-sensitive. Your customers compare value carefully. They do not buy myths at any price. They buy capability relative to budget. That gives a manufacturer volume, but it also exposes it to margin pressure. If cheaper imports arrive with acceptable performance, the working player may switch. If retail conditions change, the dealer may switch. If labor and manufacturing costs rise domestically, while competitors produce more cheaply abroad, the workhorse brand feels the pressure first. Prestige brands can sometimes sell identity above pure utility. Workhorse brands often cannot. They have to keep proving value. This is why Carlsbro's success contained the seeds of its later difficulty. Its great virtue was that it understood ordinary musicians. Its danger was that ordinary musicians live in economic reality very closely. A brand built around practical affordability is deeply exposed to global cost competition. Even so, during these years, that future was not yet settled. Carlsbro still looked like a robust British manufacturer with range, retail presence, technical capacity, and cultural reach. The plant mattered, the dealer network mattered, the products mattered. And there was still something characteristically British in the company's sound and presentation. Not extravagant, not over-polished, but confident, direct, and made for use. Those years created the memory that sustains the brand even now. When people remember old Carlsbro gear fondly, they are often remembering more than tone. They are remembering a time when a regional British manufacturer could build equipment for ordinary players at meaningful scale and still seem rooted in place. That memory is powerful, but memory is not enough to protect a company from structural change. The hardest industrial problems are often not the ones a factory can solve on the bench. A weak joint can be reinforced. A noisy circuit can be traced. A cabinet resonance can be redesigned. A production bottleneck can be studied. But what does a manufacturer do when its products are respected, widely used, even loved by working musicians, and still cannot quite cross into the top symbolic tier of the market? That was part of Carlsbro's predicament. Later observers captured it well, just as Selmer had often served as a practical alternative to Vox in an earlier period. Carlsbro never fully won the glory that Marshall achieved in the 1970s, even though the quality was not necessarily the issue. Musicians used Carlsbro for years, then often moved toward Marshall when they made it. This dynamic matters because it shaped how the brand occupied the market. Carlsbro was not the embarrassing, cheap option. It was the credible, solid, working option. But for many players, it was still the amp before the dream amp. That distinction might sound superficial, yet in manufacturing it becomes decisive. Symbolic hierarchy affects dealer enthusiasm, resale value, magazine coverage, artist associations, and the emotional energy around a brand. A company can sell very successfully without winning that battle, but it will often have to work harder for less cultural leverage. In practical terms, this meant Carlsbro had to keep earning loyalty through performance and value rather than through untouchable prestige. That is a respectable way to build a business. It is also a demanding one. Every product line has to justify itself. Every range has to hit the right balance. Every shift in the market becomes dangerous because customers are not necessarily buying into an irreplaceable aura. They are buying into a calculation, and calculations change. By the 1980s and 1990s, the broader musical equipment world was shifting. Manufacturing was becoming more international. Competition from the Far East increased. Retail became more crowded and more professionalized. Product categories multiplied. Consumer expectations changed. Brand history still mattered, but cost structures mattered more. The idea that a British regional manufacturer could simply continue as before was becoming harder to sustain. At the same time, the human foundations of Carlsbro's continuity were beginning to weaken. One company history records that in 1994, Carlsbro Retail was the subject of a management buyout by Keith Woodcock and was renamed Academy of Sound. That is important because it shows the company's ecosystem becoming less unified. The retail side that had once grown from the manufacturing operation was now taking a separate path. That is not necessarily a sign of decline by itself, but it does indicate institutional change. The integrated model that had helped make Carlsbro distinctive was no longer fixed. Then came a far more serious rupture. In the same year, Stuart Mercer was diagnosed with cancer, and he died in May 1995. Sheila Mercer then managed the company. It is difficult to overstate what a founder loss means in a business whose culture has been shaped so directly by the founder's technical judgment, habits, and historical memory. Not every founder is equally important after scale is achieved. Some companies outgrow their founders early. Carlsbro does not seem to have been that kind of company. Mercer was bound into the story at every level: origin, design, resilience, technical evolution, and identity. Even when the company had become much larger, it still presented him as central to its ethos. When such a person disappears, the question is not only who owns the company next, it is whether the company can still recognize itself. This is the moment when industrial decline usually stops being a simple market narrative. People like to say a company lost competitiveness, or failed to innovate, or got undercut. Sometimes that is true. But often the deeper reality is that several stabilizing structures begin to weaken at once. A firm loses founder continuity. Its retail and manufacturing branches separate. The market becomes more price-driven. Foreign competition intensifies. Prestige remains limited. Loyal customers age or move upward. Dealers have more options. Costs rise. Nothing has to explode for a company to enter danger. This layered fragility is crucial in understanding Carlsbro. It was not a single fatal scandal story. It was not the collapse of a fraudulent fantasy. It was a real company with a real industrial history, moving into a harder era while losing some of the people and arrangements that had given it coherence. That kind of decline is more common and in some ways sadder than dramatic failure, because it means the company may still be doing many things right while the ground shifts under it. Ownership change can be sold as renewal. Sometimes it is. But it can also be a sign that a company has entered a period in which continuity must be reconstructed repeatedly instead of inherited naturally. After Stuart Mercer's death and the transitional period that followed, Carlsbro changed hands more than once. In 1996, according to the company's published history from the 2000s, Carlsbro Electronics was sold to Pectron, an electronics manufacturing company based in Derby. Then, after several years, the business was sold again, and on 2 January 2001 Andrew Bishop bought Carlsbro. On paper, such transactions can look orderly. In practice, each sale raises difficult questions. What exactly is being bought? The premises, the inventory, the brand equity, the dealer relationships, the design archives, the workforce knowledge, the right to say this is still the same company. Ownership transfer is not merely legal, it is interpretive. Each new owner decides what part of the old identity matters enough to preserve. The later Carlsbro history published under Andrew Bishop presented the company as having regained pioneering spirit under his ownership. That tells us something about how the company wanted this period to be understood, not as terminal decline, but as recovery and modernization. There is no need to dismiss that entirely. Firms do sometimes regain momentum under new ownership. The more important point is what conditions that renewed momentum had to confront. By the early 2000s, the economics of making musical equipment in Britain had become far more punishing. This was not only a Carlsbro problem, it was part of a much larger industrial transformation. Manufacturing networks were becoming global. Asian production, especially in China, was reshaping expectations of what equipment should cost. British design and British brand heritage still had value, but domestic mass manufacture faced much stiffer competition. Here, Carlsbro faced a dilemma common to many second-tier and middle-market Western manufacturers. To remain purely domestic in production could become economically dangerous. To move manufacturing abroad could protect the brand commercially, but at the cost of hollowing out the very industrial base that gave the brand its character. In 2002, according to Carlsbro's own account, a deal was struck for Chinese manufacture of British designs in order to provide quality mass manufacturing and a competitive edge against Far Eastern competition. The company also emphasized that some custom design and build capability remained in the UK, while larger-scale production rolled off the line in China. That sentence captures the compromise perfectly. It is pragmatic, it is understandable, and it is ominous. Pragmatic, because a company in Carlsbro's market position could not ignore global manufacturing costs forever. Understandable, because moving production or part of production offshore was increasingly normal across many industries. Ominous, because once a manufacturer begins separating brand, design, and final industrial place, the logic rarely stops at a neat halfway point. The company may tell itself that the UK will retain the clever work while overseas plants handle the scalable work, but over time, the balance of power can shift. Manufacturing knowledge follows production. Supply chains consolidate around new centres. What begins as partnership can become dependency. For a while, however, this strategy may have seemed like survival through adaptation. Carlsbro could still trade on British design identity while accessing lower-cost production. It could refresh its catalogue, expand internationally, and speak the language of value. New series sat alongside heritage names. The company could invoke the past while pursuing a more global future. The problem is that from the perspective of the factory itself, this kind of strategy changes the meaning of success. If the brand sells well, but fewer products are being made in the historic plant, is that growth or substitution? If the catalogue broadens, but the local workforce narrows, what exactly is being preserved? If design remains nominally British, but the material act of manufacture migrates, what is left in the old town besides memory and administration? These are not sentimental questions. They are industrial questions. A plant does not live on design language alone. It lives on production. That is why the Carlsbro story becomes larger than music equipment. It belongs to a wider British pattern. Many brands survived by detaching name from place. They remained visible in the market, but the communities that once hosted their work lost the dense, skilled, repetitive labour that had made those names meaningful in the first place. Carlsbro's ownership changes, therefore, were not only business events, they were stages in a deeper transformation from a founder-led, place-rooted manufacturer into a company increasingly forced to decide which parts of its identity were commercially necessary and which were expendable. And the part most often judged expendable across British industry was local mass manufacture. Outsourcing is often explained as if it were a neutral technical decision, almost a simple matter of arithmetic. Costs here, lower costs there, competition rising, margins tightening. Rational management responds. The story is framed as inevitable, but inevitability is usually just hindsight wearing a suit. In reality, outsourcing is a choice made inside pressure. It reflects real constraints, but it also reflects assumptions about what a company is for. Is the purpose to preserve local industrial capacity, to protect jobs, to sustain a regional skill base, to keep a name alive at almost any cost, to maximize competitiveness in a changed market? Different answers lead to different futures. By the early 2000s, Carlsbro was operating in precisely the environment that made outsourcing seem rational. Musical equipment manufacturing had become intensely global. Far Eastern factories could produce at scales and prices that British firms struggled to match. Dealers expected competitive pricing. Customers in the semi-professional market were cost-conscious. Heritage alone could not guarantee orders. Under those conditions, moving production abroad could appear not as betrayal, but as prudence. Carlsbro's own account framed the 2002 manufacturing deal in exactly that way. British designs would gain a cost-competitive edge through Chinese mass manufacture. That is a classic formulation from the era. It suggests continuity of intelligence with a change of location. We still design, we still specify, we still control. We simply manufacture where the economics now make more sense. There is a real logic to that. It may even save a company in the short term. The trouble is that factories are not short-term abstractions. They are living systems of practice. A cabinet builder in Nottinghamshire and a line worker in Ningbo may both contribute to the same brand, but they are not interchangeable from the perspective of place, memory, or regional industrial identity. Once the volume shifts, the old factory's role becomes harder to justify at scale. Some design may remain, some custom work may remain, some testing or development may remain, but the center of gravity moves. At that point, the company can still claim Britishness, and perhaps honestly in certain respects. Yet, something has altered fundamentally. The factory is no longer the heart of the brand. It becomes one node among others, and often a shrinking one. For Carlsbro, this mattered especially because the company had never been only a badge. Its historical strength lay in being a practical British manufacturer for working musicians. The plant and the brand were once inseparable in the user's imagination, even if the customer did not know the exact address. An amp made in Nottinghamshire by a company that had grown from local repair culture meant something. It embodied a chain of competence and place. Outsourcing interrupts that chain. That does not automatically make it wrong. But it does mean the company begins operating with two stories at once. One story says, we are preserving the brand by adapting to modern conditions. The other says, we are preserving the brand by letting go of the industrial arrangement that created it. Those two stories can coexist for a while. Eventually, they begin to strain against each other. What disappears first is not always the name. Often it is the density of local work. Fewer people are needed. Fewer physical processes remain. Fewer apprenticeships make sense. Fewer local suppliers depend on the plant. Fewer repair traditions stay close to manufacture. The ecosystem thins. And then something else happens. Once a brand proves it can survive with separated production, future ownership becomes easier to imagine in more abstract terms. Buyers are no longer really buying a factory culture. They are buying intellectual property, reputation, product categories, dealer access, and market position. The company becomes easier to trade because it is less tied to one place. This is one of the hidden consequences of outsourcing. It does not just move production. It changes what a company can become in the eyes of owners and future owners. For the workers and towns shaped by the old model, this is devastating in a specific way. Closure is one kind of pain. Hollowing out is another. Closure at least names the loss. Hollowing out asks people to watch the name continue, while the work that gave the name meaning gradually leaves. Carlsbro's story sits squarely inside that experience. Because by the late 2000s, whatever strategic logic had guided its earlier adaptation, the company was no longer insulated from crisis. The official language of business failure often sounds strangely bloodless. Appointment of administrator, statement of affairs, progress report, notice of move from administration to creditors, voluntary liquidation. These phrases are designed to classify events after the human damage is already underway. In Carlsbro's case, company's house records show the appointment of an administrator in late February 2009. Progress reports and related insolvency filings followed, and in 2010, the company formally moved from administration into creditors' voluntary liquidation. On paper, that is a sequence of documents. In lived reality, it is the moment when a long industrial story breaks. By then, the wider pressures were severe. Britain was in the shadow of the financial crisis. Credit conditions were difficult. Consumer and dealer confidence were weaker. Businesses already navigating years of market change were more exposed. For a company operating in a competitive, cost-sensitive sector, this was a dangerous climate. It would be too simple to say the administration of 2009 was caused only by the global crash. The deeper causes ran backward through years: ownership transitions, international competition, manufacturing shifts, the challenge of preserving value in a middle market, and the long erosion of the old industrial model. But crises, like 2008 and 2009, have a way of exposing every existing weakness at once. They do not create all the problems, they force them into the open. What matters in the Carlsbro story is not only that a company entered administration, many companies do. What matters is what this meant for a brand whose identity had once been so bound to British regional manufacture. When administration arrives at that kind of business, the silence is not only commercial, it is spatial. Offices become uncertain, production becomes uncertain, stock becomes uncertain. The fate of the plant becomes uncertain. Workers who may have spent years around the same processes begin living in suspended time. Dealers hesitate. Customers wonder whether support still exists. The brand, which once stood for practical continuity, becomes a question mark. And yet even here, Carlsbro's story refuses to fit a clean extinction narrative. The company did not vanish permanently. That is what makes this story more unsettling than a simple rise and fall tragedy. The brand survived, but not in the same industrial form. After the collapse period, Carlsbro later emerged under new Chinese ownership. Trade reporting in 2010 announced that Sound King would relaunch the Carlsbro brand at the 2011 Music Mess, describing it as now under a new Chinese parent company. The relaunch promised classic guitar stacks and combos, acoustic amplification, portable PA, mixing consoles, accessories, and digital products. In commercial terms, that is resurrection. In industrial terms, it is something else. Because a relaunch of the brand is not a restoration of the old plant world. The catalogue may return, heritage names may return, classic models may be reintroduced, marketing may celebrate distinguished history. But the human and regional fabric of the original manufacturing system is not automatically restored by a trade show comeback. This distinction is essential. Too many industrial stories are flattened into the question, did the company survive or not? Carlsbro shows why that is inadequate. The better question is, what survived and what did not? The answer seems to be that the name survived more completely than the original manufacturing ecology. That is why the image of a silent factory matters so much here. Even if products bearing the badge can still be bought, the old relationship between brand and place has been transformed. The Carlsbro plant as a living symbol of British working musician manufacture belongs to another era, and once that silence arrives, it reveals what the company really represented. It was never just a maker of amps. It was a local concentration of know-how, labour, aspiration, and repeat custom built over decades. When that quiet arrives, the loss is economic, but it is also cultural. A town loses one more place, where skilled practical work gave a regional name its weight. There is a modern kind of afterlife in which a company can continue without really continuing. Its logo remains active, its website talks about heritage, its products still circulate, new catalogues are printed. The brand is not dead in the legal sense, and not even dead in the market sense. Yet the thing many people thought they were admiring all along the rooted, local, manufacturing reality behind the badge has changed so much that the old and new versions share a name more fully than they share a condition. Carlsbro belongs to that category. Later, brand histories present the company as still advancing, with product development and engineering based in the UK and production line capability centered on Sound King's manufacturing base in Ningbo. From one point of view, that is a credible continuation. Brands evolve, supply chains globalize, some design work remains close to origin, while larger scale production moves abroad. This is ordinary 21st century capitalism. But from another point of view, the transformation is profound. The Carlsbro that once grew out of Mansfield and Nottinghamshire, that moved into Cross Drive, that cut cabinets and built amplifiers for working musicians in Britain, cannot be equated too casually with a later multinational configuration that preserves the name while reorganizing the substance. This does not mean the current products are illegitimate. It means the historical meaning of the brand has shifted. That shift is the real ending of the Carlsbro plant's story, because the plant mattered not only for what it produced, but for what kind of Britain it represented. A Britain in which regional technical skill could become industrial scale. A Britain in which a young repairman could build products in improvised spaces, grow through local demand, survive catastrophe, build a factory, expand into retail, sell nationally and internationally, and serve musicians across the broad middle of cultural life. A Britain in which the maker of dependable gear could still occupy real economic ground. When that world weakens, the losses are easy to underestimate because they do not always look glamorous. The closure or hollowing out of an amplifier plant is not treated with the same gravity as the fall of a steelworks or a shipyard, but the principle is related. A town loses work. A sector loses competence. A country loses a little more of the habit of making things locally. Cultural industries become more detached from the places that once built their tools. Carlsbro also reminds us that the decline of industry is often not the decline of demand. Music did not disappear. Amplification did not disappear. Sound equipment did not disappear. What changed was where the work was done, how value was captured, and which parts of the old industrial chain were judged essential enough to keep. That is why this story still matters. It matters because Carlsbro's rise was real. Its factory growth was real. Its place in working musicians' lives was real. And its transformation tells us something larger than the fate of one brand. It tells us how easily an industrial culture can be stripped down to heritage language, while the labour that made the heritage disappears. A revived logo can be sold. A silent cabinet shop cannot be relaunched so easily. A catalogue can quote history. A lost workforce cannot simply be reassembled from nostalgia. So when people remember Carlsbro, they should remember more than the old amps and the familiar badge. They should remember the world that produced them, the bathroom bench and the greengrocer's back room, the first local gigs, the Midlands demand, the factory fire, the move to Cross Drive, the solid-state gamble, the workhorse years, the shops, the export reach, the ownership changes, the outsourcing logic, the administration papers, and the uneasy survival of the name after the old industrial certainty had gone. The real question was never just whether Carlsbro could keep selling products. The real question was whether a company built as a practical British manufacturing culture could remain itself once the work that defined it began to leave. That question reaches far beyond one amplifier plant. It reaches into the long story of modern Britain, a country still rich in names, still rich in design talent, still rich in memory, but less and less certain that the making must happen where the memory was formed. And perhaps that is why the quiet of a factory floor can feel so haunting, because it is not only the end of noise, it is the end of continuity. The handles, cabinets, wiring looms, speaker cones and bench tests all once belonged to one place and one chain of skill. When that chain breaks, the products may continue. But something harder to replace, something almost civic, drops out of the world. Carlsbro's story is therefore not merely about disappearance, it is about conversion. A manufacturing culture became a heritage brand. A regional industrial system became a globalized commercial identity. A plant that once helped voice Britain's working musicians became, in the end, a reminder of how often the name stays after the work leaves. That is why the story deserves to be told, not because Carlsbro was the loudest name in British amplification, but because it may have been one of the most revealing,